Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program. My name is Ayan Jama. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Thank you for joining us for today's program. I am the acting manager for Diversity Inclusion Department at the University Student Union. Again, thank you for joining us for the second part of examining our campus series and Essential Talks sponsored program. This is a three-part series that provides us with opportunities to foster essential conversations while analyzing our campus culture and the historical evidence that prevents the eradication of racism in systems of higher education. The first part of this series, titled Challenging Microaggressions and Implicit Biases, featured Dr. Davis III. Today's program, titled What Are Modern Day Fuels of Racism, led by esteemed scholar and activist Dr. Angela Davis, will allow us to continue the discourse. The final part of this series, which is, I must note, it's still pending, and if all goes according to plan, we will have Dr. Ibram X. Kendi to join us for a program titled Becoming an Anti-Racist Advocate. Today's program is hosted by your CSUN University Student Union, your CSUN University Counseling Services, Office of Student Success, the Department of the Department of Africana Studies, and the funding received from the Diversity and Equity Innovation Grant. Today, we take a step further to learn the inner workings of American hierarchy that goes beyond the confines of race, class, and gender. As we begin, we'd like to start by acknowledging and recognizing the land in which we now occupy. I now call on to Sam Ruiz to join me to provide the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Ayan. We know land acknowledgements are used by Native people and non-natives to recognize Indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the land on which we now live. California State University Northridge recognizes and acknowledges the Sesevitam, the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of Sesebenga that is now occupied by our institution. And it honors their elders, past and present, and the Sesevitam descendants who are citizens of the Fernandino Tatavitam Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that the Sesevitam are still here, and we are committed to uplifting their stories, culture, and community. Consistent with our CSUN values of respecting all people and our alliances with the community, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University Northridge accountable to the needs of American Indian peoples in the region.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sam, and everyone. I just share a link in the chat for more information that you can take a look at. Again, thank you, Sam. And before we get started today's program, we have some logistical and housekeeping items. As participants in today's program, you have access to the chat function to share your thoughts and interact with us. You can also submit questions through the chat as well as through the Q&A in the bottom of your screen when we start the Q&A session. You'll find closed captioning that you may use as needed, as well as we have our interpreters today, Kevin, who's present now, and Rachel, who's joining us, who you may pin if needed, and they will remain during the duration of the program. If you have any questions throughout the duration of the program, please place them in the chat or either private message myself or Sam. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Freddie Sanchez, who needs no introduction, but I call on to Dr. Freddie Sanchez.
Thanks, Ayan. So I am Freddie Sanchez. I serve as the Interim Assistant Vice President of Student Affairs for Equity and Inclusion. Ayan, Sam, thank you so much for leading today's program, as well with Dr. Paulette Teresa Shekto, who you'll meet in a little bit, and Dr. Melanie Bocanegra. Dr. Paulette Teresa Shekto, thank you so much for your continued contribution and helping co-author the Essential Talks program that received the Diversity and Equity Innovation Grant, which partially funded today's program. For all of you, Essential Talks addresses the swelling need for cultural humility and social change in the face of racial trauma and anti-Blackness in our communities. At CSUN, we continue to identify ways in which we can elevate our Black student body, our faculty, and our staff. Our Commission on Diversity and Inclusion, the Black Student Success Council, the Black Faculty and Staff Association, the Black Student Success Initiative, our Black student organizations, and the countless other efforts taking place on campus continue to create pathways in which we can better serve our community and eliminate persistence gaps. We understand more we understand more is needed and acknowledge our commitment to creating a structure grounded in equity, core values, and justice. As such, I invite you all to participate in the CSUN road mapping process. Your voice is critical to the future of our campus. If you have not participated, we have dropped the link in the chat. Now, I want to thank the planning team whose foresight has allowed us to engage as a campus community to dialogue on ways we can dismantle systemic inequities and oppressive systems by navigating and eradicating conversations of racism. We welcome our entire CSUN community to embark on this journey with Dr. Angela Davis today. Dr. Davis, we are humbled by your presence and excited to have you speak on our campus. We look forward to hearing your message and the recommendations you will likely give us as we collectively fight against modern day fields of racism. Thank you all for joining us virtually and enjoy the program.
I would now like to introduce our moderators for today's program. Our first moderator, Dr. Paulette Teresa Chattel, is a tenured faculty counselor at CSUN's University Counseling Services, along with being the creative agent for Wisdom, a mentoring program on campus for young Black women to assist them with academic retention, career development, and life skills. She has provided a variety of campus outreach trainings such as Black women and body image and Black beauty and binge eating. She created the Grief and Loss Support Group, which is a germane resource for students. She has taught multicultural psychology and social justice to interns both at UCS and within the community for the past 15 years. Welcome, Dr. Paulette.
Wonderful. Our second moderator today joining us is also Dr. Melanie Bocanegra, who will be joining Dr. Chattel today. Dr. Melanie Bocanegra is the Associate Vice President for Student Success since March 2020. Dr. Bocanegra has served as Associate Dean STEM and Student Equity Programs in Academic Affairs at Santa Monica College, and in that capacity also served as the college's Director of STEM Initiatives. From 2004 to 2012, Dr. Bocanegra served in a number of roles at Stanford University School of Medicine, serving as the Stanford Medical School Higher Education Research Program Director, the Education Programs Planner, and the Assistant Dean of Graduate Education and Director of Equity. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Melanie Bocanegra.
So good afternoon, everyone. Just before introducing our esteemed guests, I want to give a special shout out to CSUN's Project Rebound, that's led by Dr. Martha Escobar, Professor of the Chicano Studies here at CSUN. Project Rebound supports formerly incarcerated people into higher education. And at CSUN, there are currently 31 students in this program, 9 of whom are graduating and 4 with their master's and 5 with their undergraduate degrees. Welcome, Project Rebound. Turning our focus to our esteemed guest, Dr. Angela Davis, we look forward to hearing about the inner workings of an American hierarchy that goes beyond the confines of race, class, and gender. Having said that, our speaker today is no newcomer to these issues. Through her activism and her scholarship over the many decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in movements for human rights and social justice around the world. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Professor Davis's teaching career has taken her to San Francisco State University, Mills College, UCS Berkeley. She also has taught at UCLA, Vassar, Syracuse University, the Claremont Colleges, and Stanford University. Most recently, she spent 15 years at the University of California at Santa Cruz, where she is now Distinguished Professor of Emerita of History of Consciousness and an interdisciplinary PhD program and of Feminist Studies. Angela Davis is the author of 10 books and has lectured throughout the United States as well as in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experiences in the early 70s as a person who spent 8 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. She also has conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Her recent book include Abolition Democracy and Our Prisons Obsolete, which is about the abolition of the prison industrial complex, as well as a new edition of Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and a collection of essays entitled The Meaning of Freedom. Her most recent book of essays, called Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement, was published in February 2016. And I believe it's correct to say that there has been a recent re-edition, a hardcover copy of her autobiography that was first published back in '74, and the hard copy came out last year. It is my great honor and esteemed pleasure to welcome Dr. Davis to CSUN. So, Dr. Melanie?
Yes, thank you so much. I was just enjoying the bio, Dr. Davis. I'm sure you get that a lot of just hearing all of your accomplishments over the years. So I have the first question. We can't legislate people's hearts to do what's legal and equitable. And, at the intersection of racism, classism, sexism, all of these isms continue to rear their ugly heads. We try to do this work together. How can students best participate in activism to address some of these systemic issues we see in healthcare, education, housing, to make significant change and decrease these isms that continue to sort of plague our efforts?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to spend some time with you at Cal State Northridge. I'm sorry we weren't able to arrange an in-person visit. I know that is what was initially intended, but with this, Zoom becoming so much a part of our lives, our schedules seem to have expanded and intensified. But I'm happy to spend some time with you, faculty and students, of course, in conversation around the question of contemporary manifestations of racism. Now, let me, also, I want to send a special shout out to the students who are affiliated with Project Rebound. And I want them to know that many years ago, I taught at San Francisco State University, where the very first chapter of Project Rebound was created. And that is one of the programs that I have supported for many decades. So I want to thank all of the participants as well as the mentors and faculty members affiliated with Project Rebound. Now, this is a period in which we get to witness how activism can create change. I'm someone who has always believed that. And as a matter of fact, decades ago, when people would ask me why I didn't become involved in electoral politics. Not that I don't think electoral politics is important. It is important. But I do think that fundamental change comes always as a consequence of people coming together, creating people's power and demonstrating that power. And we've seen many instances of that in the recent period. So I think that young people and young students today are really privileged to be living at a time when they can actually see the material consequences of activist work. It hasn't always been that way, even though there have always been activists and people have always continued to organize and struggle, even when it did not appear as if we were having the kind of impact we wanted to have on the larger society. There are so many ways in which one can help to generate collective voices and collective power. I want to emphasize, first of all, that as important as individuals are, as individuals, we rarely have the occasion to bring about the kind of earth-shaking change that we need in a country that is founded on racism and class bias and heteropatriarchy. And also, if you look at the individual leaders, whether you're referring to political leaders or cultural leaders, it's very rare that one person has the kind of impact that will bring lasting change to our society. So I want to emphasize, first of all, the need to do a critique of the ideologies of individualism that have so pervaded our lives. We are encouraged to always think about ourselves as the most important factor. We're always encouraged to think about the individual as the basic unit of society, forgetting that as individuals, we are always produced by communities and within communities, and our relation to others is actually what makes us. And so I want to just throw that out there in the very beginning, that during this period, we need to learn how to engage in critiques of individualism. And students, particularly students who come from backgrounds that should have, as I do, that should have taught us that we need to engage in the quest for a better world, for more education, for housing for everyone, for healthcare, etc. So yeah, now having said that, I don't think that there is a formula that we can rely on that will tell us how students should become active in movements and political organizing. I think that every contribution is valuable. I can say again that I think collective contributions are more powerful than simply individual contributions. So that would mean that students need to find ways to become members of organizations, to become affiliated with groups, rather than thinking that as individuals they can have this impact themselves. Now, having said that, my second point, the message that I would like to convey is that everyone should find their own mode of participating. We're all different. I've been criticizing individualism but I'm not criticizing individuality. I think powerful communities are created when different people who are individually, quite different come together based on their differences. And I know we have the habit of talking about moving beyond, transcending differences, right? Whenever we talk about unity, we talk about unity across difference, or unity that transcends difference. And I want to think of difference as that which can bring us together. And therefore, our individualities can come together to create flourishing and creative communities. And so that means that students should ask themselves about their own passions and participate in movements and in campaigns and in other collective approaches based on their own talents and their own proclivities and what brings them joy, what helps to fulfill them. I think that is the kind of collective effort that can bring about change. So, whether it's as an intellectual who is a historian or a literary scholar or whatever, whether it is as someone who actually wants to engage in organizing, some people love that work. Other people hate going to meetings, and that's okay. Whether it is as a poet or as a musician, and I could continue on and on. Whatever brings you joy should be the basis for your contribution to this collective quest for freedom.
Thank you so much for getting us started in such a robust and effective and substantive way. We already need to say we salute you for all of your contributions. And as we continue in this conversation around modern day fuels of racism and other isms, we know that sometimes we do learn from our history. I believe it was back in 1903 that W.B. Du Bois, he talked about the biggest problem facing the 20th century, he felt, was the color line. We want to know what you believe is the biggest problem facing the US today.
That's a very difficult question. And I should tell you that as someone who has attempted to bring feminist approaches together with Marxist approaches, I tend to shy away from answering questions that require me to choose one thing. Of course, if I were to choose one issue, which I'm not going to do, I would say, like Du Bois said in 1903 about the problem of the 20th century being the color line, the problem of the 20th century is also fundamentally racism. Mm-hmm. But I would talk about racism in a way that is intersectional. Mm-hmm. I would talk about racial capitalism. I would talk about heteropatriarchy that is embedded in the racism. I would talk about the ways in which racism has contributed to the climate crisis and the environmental crisis. I would talk about racism and disability and the ways in which the issue of mass incarceration, which affects in the first place Indigenous people, Black people, and other people of color. Indigenous people still remain still have the highest per capita rate of incarceration. Yeah, so I would, you see, I think what we have learned over the period is that we cannot choose one separate issue and expect it to do the work that we want it to do. We learn that we cannot talk about racism without talking about misogyny. Because if we're talking about anti-Black racism, that leads us to develop a masculinist approaches to challenging racism. And we know, thanks to the work that feminism, and when I speak about feminism, of course, it's not the feminism that is mainstream feminism. It's anti-racist feminism. It's anti-capitalist feminism. So this is a different methodology, and it kind of militates against what Western logic requires, and I think that means that even as we try to engage in these struggles, whether they're intellectual, whether they're community struggles, we also have to struggle with the very conceptual apparatus that we rely on to name those struggles. And so this is why students are so important. And this is why students can play a role in encouraging these movements that can really help to bring about fundamental change.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think everyone is so inspired. The chat is just exploding with reactions and just inspirational things that they're quoting you already. And getting back to our students, one thing that stands out for me is that, Toni Morrison encouraged you to publish your biography at the age of 26, an age that some of our students are right now. And given the perspectives of people of color are often left out of history and our education systems, how important is it for our university faculty and staff to encourage our minoritized students to document the history that they are currently living through, their experiences? And what role should higher ed play in elevating those stories, as part of our educational missions?
Yeah, I totally agree with the premises of your question, and I will say that I did not have the insight at that age to understand what kind of contribution I might be able to make by writing an autobiography. As I've said many times, the first time I met Toni Morrison was when she was representing Random House. She was one of the only Black editors at that time. And she asked me if I would write an autobiography. And I think I laughed. I said, who am I to write an autobiography? I'm not even 30 years old. I'm, 26 or how, no, I think I may have been a little older. I was 26, I think, when I was arrested. And through conversations with her, I recognized that it would be possible to write a political autobiography. And 50 years later, 50 years after that autobiography was published, it was reissued this, as a matter of fact, just a couple of months ago. I had to read it for the audiobook. And I have to tell you that oftentimes I really hate reading my own work. Because I'm so critical. I say, how could I have said that? I talk back to myself, don't you know, et cetera, et cetera. But reading it, narrating it, made me recognize the continuities between that period and the current moment. and why it's so important to have a record of what happened a half century ago in order to urge us to move forward today. And I am so grateful to Toni Morrison. Toni became a very close friend as a consequence of that relationship that was initially based on writing. And I later realized that that she made the conscious decision to use her positionality as an editor in a major publishing concern to help to create a historical record. And getting back to what I was saying about how people can participate, you know, Toni was not someone who loved marching and demonstrating and so forth. I mean, I do, but that wasn't her thing. And so she figured out that she could contribute using her talents. And therefore, she not only approached me about writing memoirs and a memoir or an autobiography, she approached Muhammad Ali, she approached Huey Newton, George Jackson, and then so many Black women writers. Black women's literature would not be what it is today without Toni Morrison, and not only about her own work, but about, you know, all of the Black women she published.
Thank you for sharing that. And Toni Morrison holds a special place with so many of us and our students.
Yes, indeed. We know that you have such an expansive legacy. There wouldn't be enough time to get into all of the areas today. We're thinking especially with this next question around the area of the concept of prison abolition, which is something that's very meaningful, we know, to you. And we want to ask you, does the Eighth Amendment, and for our audience to remind them, it's the absence of cruel and unusual punishment by the federal government. Does that Eighth Amendment really exist when we live in a culture that imposes the death penalty, solitary confinement, and super maximum security prisons where individuals become intrinsically dehumanized?
Yeah, that is such an important question. And I want to say that the Constitution is a document that needs to be constantly read and reread and criticized, critically engaged with. I think that that whole notion of cruel and unusual punishment is in many ways ideologically charged, and we do not get to understand the extent to which forms of punishment that are indeed cruel and unusual have persisted over time. There is, as a matter of fact, there is the whole notion of civil death, which is precisely the role that which is precisely the result of the role of prisons. When we think about the history of imprisonment as punishment, it actually coincides more or less with the American Revolution and the development of what we have come to call a democratic society in this country. But precisely because imprisonment as punishment consists of the deprivation of rights and liberties, it is a form of civil death. That is to say, the rights of the citizen are deprived by the process of punishment. And and what's interesting, of course, is that this notion of civil death is related to social deaths, which is, one of the ways in which slavery has been defined. Orlando Patterson's opus, Slavery and Social Death, argues that that is precisely the core meaning of slavery, depriving the enslaved person of any connection with society, or connection with ancestry, or connection with progeny. That is social death. And then civil death is the deprivation of the rights and liberties of citizenship. But what's interesting is that this notion of imprisonment as punishment could only arrive in a society which had already laid out the rights of citizens. So in that sense, it is a capitalist punishment. It is a democratic form of punishment. So that if we think about why punishment was always so marginalized, why until this recent era we haven't recognized the damage that holding millions of people behind bars does to our society. It is precisely because they were so successful in creating this apparatus of social death. And let me tell you, when I went to jail, and by the way, I spent about 18 months, almost 2 years behind bars. And my trial took place afterwards. So while I wasn't in jail, I couldn't leave the Bay Area. And there were restrictions on my movement. But my first encounter with the connection between slavery and imprisonment came when the person who became my co-defendant, Ruchell Magee, who, by the way, is still in prison. He has spent 58 years behind bars in California, and 10 years before that behind bars in Louisiana, because he had a white girlfriend in the South. But Ruchell Magee called the rebellion that happened in Marin County in 1970, which was the event in connection with which I was charged. He called it a slave rebellion, and that sounded really bizarre to me at first. I had no idea what he was talking about, but he introduced me to this case called Ruffin v. Commonwealth of Virginia. It was a case, I think in the I say around the 1850s or so, around the middle of the 19th century, in which a judge ruled that the prisoner is a slave of the state. And those very words are in that decision. And now, of course, so many scholars and activists have looked at the relationship between slavery and imprisonment. And I tend to think about it as what you might call a genealogical relationship, because incarceration bears the imprint of slavery, and as a matter of fact, reflects some of the forms of punishment that existed under slavery. So the point that I'm making is that what was seen to be so marginal and rarely affecting those outside of the people who were actually behind bars has something to do with the way in which our entire society functions, and is one of the primary reasons why we have not been able to produce a better democracy. And that largely has to do with the fact that the the institution of the prison, jails and prisons, immigrant detention facilities, all of those institutions constitute the most dramatic form of structural racism today.
Yes, thank you so much. And there is a second part to this question because we want our students to be engaged in this particular area. What sort of advice would you have for our students to become more active disruptors of these routine forms of punishment and racial subjugation?
Yeah, I think disruption is so important. But combined with criticism and disruption and protests and all of that has to be a different vision for the future, a different way of imagining the future. And this is where abolition comes in. The question actually involved abolition. Abolition, and again, those of us who see ourselves as anti-prison, anti-police abolitionists draw inspiration from the campaign to abolish slavery and from W.E.B. Du Bois, who argued that when the institution of slavery was abolished, quote unquote, by the Constitution, and this gets back to the question about the Eighth Amendment as well, the role that the Constitution plays, that the discrete institution, slavery, might have been dismantled. But as Du Bois pointed out, it did not, that did not address all of the multiple ways in which slavery had defined the very warp and woof of the fabric of the United States of America, how it had defined its major institutions, its schools, its economic institutions, its healthcare institutions. And so Du Bois argued that abolition it essentially fails if it is so myopic that it only addresses one institution. And so in many ways, what we're doing in the 21st century is taking up the work that really should have begun in the immediate aftermath of slavery. We're still living the after lives of slavery, and challenging the prison industrial complex, and I would say it even in challenging institutions such as ICE and other police structures. Whether you're talking about the police on school campuses or the police in our community or the federal police, we're doing work that relates to the effort to abolish slavery and its foundation, which was colonialism. And let's not forget that indigenous people were the first targets of this long project, and that we can't think about slavery without examining its relationship to colonialism, or we can't think about Black history without also indigenous history, because the two histories are totally intertwined, and the history of Latinx communities.
Absolutely.
Oh, and let me just say that, I noticed in the introduction, that's an introduction that's a little dated, but I participated in another book which answers a lot of these questions. And the title of that book is, it's a collaborative book. I wrote it with 3 other people. It's called Abolition, Feminism, Abolition period, Feminism period, Now period. And that is a book I wrote with Gina Dent, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie.
How long ago was that published?
That was published at the end of January, the same time as my the second edition or the fourth edition of the autobiography was published.
And I'll tell you, the hard copy of that autobiography looks really good on my bookshelf.
Thank you, thank you.
So I think this really, our next question is about, you know, leading these movements as students or as scholars, as activists. You know, in today's society, especially our Black students are exposed to media outlets and that continue to stereotype them and spread misinformation campaigns, you know, really aimed at demonizing these kinds of efforts around activism, especially around the prison systems. And although these tactics are not new, you know, social media really allows for the mass distribution of these conspiracy theories in ways that have, I think, elevated their ability to harm leaders of these movements. And so, you know, how can we help our Black scholars combat these terror tactics? And to a live question, you know, preserve their mental health while fighting against these systems of oppression?
Oh, that's a huge question,
I know.
but an essential question, a very important question. And, you know, I'm not someone who grew up with social media. And it's created a whole new playing field. And the extent to which information that is blatantly false can proliferate so rapidly within social media is something that, you know, we never experienced. I can remember back in the 60s when we were thinking about the media, what was called the mass media, and you know, Marshall McLuhan wrote this analysis of the mass media, and he said the medium is the message.
Mm.
And I think that is much more applicable to the situation we find ourselves in today, that the medium precisely is the message. And it has helped to prevent us from developing the critical capacity to discern, you know, what is true and what is false.
Mhm.
Excuse me, I have to.
Oh, sure, take a moment.
So, you know, and I don't even know whether I have an answer to that question, but I do think that we need to ponder it, and we need to be aware of the extent to which the rapid proliferation of information does not amount to knowledge.
Mm.
And I think students especially should develop the capacity to discern what counts as information, which can be true or false, right? And what counts as deep knowledge. You know, how is knowledge produced? And, you know, as a teacher, I always tell my students that, you know, information is everywhere. And I'm not so much interested in your learning the facts, but I'm interested in your capacity to understand in a profound way the way knowledge is constructed, and to always learn how to ask questions. I tell my students, I'm much more interested in your questions than I am your answers. Because if you don't know how to formulate the kinds of questions that will help us to understand our worlds, then whatever answers you come up with are going to be irrelevant. So that again means, and I think sort of vaguely made this point earlier in the conversation, that we not only have to, search for the answers to our questions, we have to be able to grasp the extent to which the logic that is inherent in our questions determine what we're going to find. And so we have to learn how to be critical of the very conceptual apparatus that we use to go out in search of knowledge. To me, that is what is called critical thinking. I was trained in critical theory, so I was always trained to look back at my concepts and my categories, as well as looking, for the answers in the research that I'm doing. For example, if you're thinking about prisons, and you assume that imprisonment is the only way to address harm, you're only going to come up with answers that involve police and prisons and so forth. If you ask yourself, why is it that I have been primed to always think about police and prisons as the way to create safety and security in our society, then maybe you'll ask different kinds of questions. You'll ask about the role that housing plays in creating a secure and safe society, and the role that education plays, and why not free healthcare, especially mental health care? Why is it that people who have mental disorders and who are in crisis always end up in confrontations with the police and sometimes end up dying simply because they are mentally ill? I'm thinking about what happened in New York, in Brooklyn, the subway, and this 63-year-old Black man who was supposedly the person who did it. And I'm wondering, what drove that man to do that? And why is it that no one helped him before now? So these are the kinds of questions I think that we need to ask if we want to truly create a better society, more secure society. And that's what abolition is all. To me, that's about the abolitionist imagination. So I began by saying that we have to not only protest and criticize, but we also have to be capable of imagining something new.
We so appreciate the reminder from you that it's not just one answer, not just one way, but collectively with all of our gifts and talents, certainly we can each contribute in the way that we've been created to give back to our society and humanity, of which we all are a part of. So Dr. Davis, we have about 5 minutes left before we open it up to audience Q&A. And our last question is going to hopefully be on the lighter side, but then again, it depends on how you interpret the question. In my time here at CSUN and working with different student organizations, the topic of Black hair comes up every single year that I do a seminar or that I'm engaged with WISDOM or any of the other student organizations. And to quote India Ari, I'm not my hair, I'm not this skin, I am not your expectation, I am not my hair, I'm not the skin, I am the soul that lies within. Dr. Davis, please share your words of wisdom regarding Black hair.
Oh, well, I love India Ari, and I love what you said. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that Black hair is it's also ideologically charged. It also has to do with freedom struggles. You know, I can remember many years ago when I first started to wear my hair in a natural. I was I don't know, I was in my early 20s, I guess, and I was an activist in Los Angeles, and we all knew, especially the women, but also the guys too, because the guys grew their hair a bit longer, right? That the women stopped straightening their hair and the guys wore their hair longer. So we knew that we would be stopped by the cops because we knew that that was a sign of militancy. It was a sign of protests. So we were always prepared to be stopped by the cops. And it's so interesting because in 1969, I think, I went to Cuba for the first time. And my close friend, who unfortunately is no longer with us today, Kendra Alexander, we were comrades and sisters. We were in Cuba cutting cane and participating in a program there, and the Cubans all ask us, well, why do you wear your hair like that? And we said, well, because it's a sign of the desire for revolutionary change. And I can remember some of the Cubans said, oh yeah, it's like the beards that the revolutionaries grew. Yeah, I said, yeah, like Che and Fidel and Camilo. And so they said, okay, well then that means when the revolution comes, then you'll start straightening your hair again. And we said, no, that metaphor doesn't quite work. But we know that, hair, and there have been many studies about Black hair, and we know that huge industries have also developed around Black hair. But I think that what I am impressed by is the way in which we have taught ourselves how to find beauty in ourselves, in our hair. Because there was a time when few Black women wanted to be seen in public without straight hair, right? And I can remember, I could name them on one hand. There was Miriam Makeba, who wore her hair in a natural. I remember Odetta, because I can remember when I decided to stop straightening my hair, that these were my role models. And so, while on the one hand, I have bemoaned the fact that people somehow always associate me with the natural, because I did have a pretty large natural. In California, we call them naturals. In other places, they're, called afros. But I once wrote an article called Afro Images and something else. I can't even remember the title of the article. But I was bemoaning the fact that my legacy was going to be remembered as the woman with the afro. And I said, it's not that that's so bad, but I was not the first one to wear an afro. I was imitating, other Black women, and almost all of the Black women in my circles in those days, wore naturals or afros. So anyway, it's an interesting discussion, but I think politics of appearance are important. And I've learned a lot from the many books and articles that have been written about the connection between the politics of appearance and the politics of eradicating racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism from our societies. And also, since I mentioned Cuba, I want to just say that I have actually failed in the course of this conversation to emphasize as much as I normally would the importance of internationalism, and that we cannot think of ourselves only as a single country, that we inhabit a world, and our inspirations and our comrades and those who will help us build a new world are in, all over the Americas, in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in Africa, in Asia, in the Philippines, for example, in Europe. Europe is no longer a white region it never was really. There always been Black and brown people in Europe. And so I think what's exciting about this period is that we're recognizing that the campaign against racism is a campaign that is valid literally all over the world.
Thank you so very much. Really appreciate your wisdom and the way in which you have been just so open and honest and from your heart have spoken your words to us today. And just thinking about that question on Black hair, when I had the opportunity to begin my sabbatical in South Africa, I had to come home early because of COVID, but I'm going to go back. But when I was there, I saw everything you can imagine in terms of hairstyles: straight, curly, frizzy, nappy. And when I do the lecture on Black beauty, I want our students to know that we have the opportunity to have a diversity of how we can look to the world. And it's what is within us where our beauty starts and exudes from there going outward. And in all of your work, you talk about that, how important it is for us to be connected with other people and how important it is for us to see ourselves in other people. And we cannot do that unless we love ourselves and then love other people. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So Melanie, we come to our next aspect of this afternoon's program. And I believe I'm going to turn it over to the host so she can transition us into the Q&A with our audience that's here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. This was such an honor.
Thank you, Dr. Paula, Dr. Davis, and Dr. Melanie Bocanegra for that amazing conversation. That was just listening, take it in the back. So next we have our Q&A session moderated by Dr. Paulette, who you have already met, as well as Brittany Chanel. Brittany Chanel is currently a Master of Social Work student and 2021-2022 Council for Social Work Education Minority Fellow. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brittany and Dr. Paulette.
Welcome, Brittany. I will take your lead.
Okay, sure. I know we do have one person in the audience who raised their hand, and we have a few questions in the Q&A. So maybe we can take the live person first. Awesome. Okay, so we have Christina Ayala Alcantara, and I believe somebody will spotlight her so she can come on and ask her question. Let's see, is she with us?
If we can't find her, we can come back to her.
Okay. No problem. Okay, so we can just ask one of the ones in the Q&A. So Dr. Davis, the first question we have in here is, what are your thoughts on Shaun King? He has been the target of so much criticism and rumors about his work ethic and activism. How can we draw similarities between his reputation and the reputation of civil rights leaders who are no longer with us? And that was from Deanna Kamel.
Well, You know, this is a period in which there have been numerous attacks on, you know, so many people who have been involved in struggles against racism. And I know that the question of the use of funds or misuse of funds that have been donated is one that is not only relevant to this question about Shaun King, but there have been you know, questions regarding other people affiliated with Black Lives Matter, some of the founders of Black Lives Matter. And I think that that we have to be very critical and ask questions. I know that, I mean, I don't have a particular position on Shaun King. I mean, I do know about the allegations, but I haven't studied them enough to give the kind of answer that the person who asked the question might want. But I mean, we could talk about Patrisse Cullors, for example, and the question of the purchasing of various properties, and I don't know, you know, whether it's as important to have specific answers to those specific questions as it is to operate within a framework that makes us suspicious and question the purpose of these allegations. Because regardless of whether there has been wrongdoing on anyone's part, what is so clear is that these allegations are creating huge fractures in movements and are making people less willing to engage in struggle. And this to me sounds like the tactics of the FBI, you know, whether they are or not. And I'm not, you know, saying anything about the truth of the allegations. But if we go back to examine the way in which the FBI set up Dr. Martin Luther King, and of course, we didn't have social media back then. So people didn't know about the work that the FBI was doing. But we found out later as a result of research that there were so many occasions during which the FBI forged letters and created the circumstances to discredit the Black leadership of that time. And if you think that, if you recognize how they were doing it then, you have to be sure that they have escalated their tactics and strategies to discredit Black leaders today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
We're going to move on with the next question that I have in front of me, Dr. Davis. It reads, as a somewhat older student, I can at times feel stuck between being tired and my innate need to fight the power, including the bureaucratic powers within academia, but often feel out of place if there is a lack of support, emoreso, understanding. I'm not sure what that is.
And more so understanding.
More so understanding, yeah.
Department. Okay, being one of 6 or 7 other Black students.
Right.
How do I maintain my motivation to keep fighting, to make change without getting burned out?
Exactly.
And help others to do the same. Okay.
You
Yeah.
interpret that without even looking at it.
Well, you know, that's an important question because oftentimes, we do. I mean, I've experienced burnout. You know, I can remember when I was sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night because I thought that I wasn't doing enough. And I now realize that that was in many ways the impact of the ideology of individualism on me. When I felt that I had to do it all. But if we understand our interconnections, interrelationality with others, then we don't feel that kind of need to prove that we can do it all, because we can never do it all. And we have to accept that. And we also have to accept that we get tired and need to rest. You know, I can't tell you how long it took me to recognize that I actually do need at least 8 hours of sleep a night, and that I function better. I can do more if I sleep, if I take care of myself, if I eat right, and if I take care of my body and my mind and my spirit. So I think one of the wonderful things about this period is that younger activists are aware of the need for self-care, and sometimes they go overboard with it because we can't always be, so concerned about the self that we're only always caring for the self. But we do have to do the things that make us strong. And we do have to eat right. And I always encourage people to think about the way in which our eating habits help to prop up the capitalist forms of production of food, which are oftentimes so detrimental to the health of our bodies. We have all of these fast food joints and all of the trans fats that get produced. And how many people have heart attacks and get diabetes as a result of that food? So that's something that we need to think about. And we need to encourage people to eat organically. And I would say, be aware of, what the practice of meat eating does, not only to your body, but to the environment, and be aware of the need to engage in practices that will keep your body and your mind and your spirit strong. And also the question about the organizing within a context where you don't necessarily discover as many other Black people as you might want to. And I can talk about that because, I left an all Black environment. I grew up in the segregated South, and I basically fell into an all white environment when I was in high school in New York. And I had to learn how to create community. I mean, some of this I only recognized in retrospect, but I realized that what I did was to create community, because even though the people around you may not be of the same racial background as you are, you may find kinship in their political approaches. You may find kinship in the world that they want to see. Just because you're not Black or Latinx or Muslim or Native American does not mean that you don't want to build a better world. So let's kind of realize that although we're talking about anti-Black racism, we also have to talk about anti-Latinx racism, Islamophobia, racism against Asian people. It's all interconnected. And that some of the most important contributors to the struggle for Black liberation have not necessarily been Black. You know, I mean, I think about Yuri Kochiyama, who was friends with Malcolm X and helped Malcolm X develop his internationalism and his concern for the Hiroshima survivors. And Yuri became one of the most active participants in the struggle to free political prisoners of anyone else. And of course, people may not know, but Yuri was with Malcolm when he was assassinated. And she was there and ran up to him. And as he lay dying, she was embracing him. And there are photographs of that, but people don't like to distribute those photographs because it defies the logic that we're used to. You know, what is a Japanese American woman doing hugging Malcolm X as he lay dying? But let's move beyond the barriers that racism has created and discover how we can make community with people, with like-minded people who want to struggle for a better world for us all.
Thank you so much. It's such a reminder again of the immense appreciation that we need to start having for each other, no matter what color our skin is, no matter what neighborhood we're from, no matter how we identify sexually, and so on and so on and so on. And it all, again, starts with that aspect of self-care and loving oneself. I'm going to put you on my shoulders when I go in and do therapy with my students, because everything you said about self-care, I'm sure all my colleagues from University Counseling Services were just amening. Thank you so much. I'm going to let Brittany finish us off here because I know we don't have a lot of time left. Go ahead, Brittany.
Oh goodness, there's so many good questions in here, but I think this one is pretty good. So this one is from Enrique. And so he said, I come from a family in which every male has been incarcerated going back 4 generations. Upon release or changing of their lives, most of us end up relying on corporations or good government jobs that offer meager opportunity, but opportunity nonetheless. How do I talk to families and communities like mine about radically changing systems when they seem to rely on them at the same time? Many almost see activism as biting the hand that barely feeds you or a waste of time.
Well, thank you so much, Enrique. And, you know, thank you for sharing with us the history of your family and the way in which incarceration has affected generations. And let me say that in the 1990s, when some of us began to, organize this abolitionist movement, one of the things we realized was that people were so ashamed to talk about having relatives behind bars. And one of the things we tried to do was to make it possible to have those conversations so that people would recognize that it wasn't individual defect that sent people to prison, but rather it was racism. But rather it was a whole conglomeration of social issues. So thank you so much for sharing that history. And what I would try to propose as an answer to your question is that, yes, we're all implicated in these large problems. And we're all affected by these systems and these institutions, and we work for them. And we go to school within them, right? And our housing is dependent on them. So how do we challenge them and at the same time are so essentially connected to them? And one of the things I've learned over the years is that I can never get outside. I'm always inside. I'm always implicated. I'm always involved. People ask me, how can you teach at a university for so long when universities are purveyors of racism and this and that? And my response is that we have to create communities of struggle wherever we are. Even when we think that we are benefiting from the institution, we have to be willing to work within those contradictions. And this is why I think anti-racist, anti-capitalist feminism has been so helpful to us, because we've learned that we can both be a part of something and at the same time challenge it. Sometimes we can be in favor of something and we can be opposed to it at the same time. I mean, I always say, people ask me about Obama, and I said, well, yeah, it was such an amazing moment. The first Black president, it was a world historical transformation. But at the same time, I'm opposed to the fact that Obama didn't do more about immigration issues, that more immigrants were deported under Obama than under any other president. So I can tell you so many reasons why I was opposed to his policies and his practices, but at the same time, I acknowledge how wonderful a moment that was. And so that I offer to you, Enrique, as a way of embracing the contradiction, as opposed to assuming that you have to choose one side or the other.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Davis.
Well, we certainly have been inspired, educated, and motivated today. I believe we're getting near the end of this particular segment. Am I right?
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Paulette and Brittany, for this adding on to the already amazing conversation that has been having. So many questions, in the chat or in the Q&A session, but we could be here all night if we could. So with that said, Dr. Davis does have another engagement she must hop on to. But we thank you so much for being with us, engaging with us through the chat. And we're so grateful for Dr. Davis, Angela Davis, being with us and really sharing infinite wisdom with us today, and really sharing so many things that resonated with so many of us, and intersectionality of different issues. So with that said, we now close the Q&A portion. We would like not only thank Dr. Davis, but our amazing audience. Thank you so much for your questions, very captivating questions. Thank you again for guiding us through this. We're so grateful for our University Student Union, University Counseling Services, the Office of Student Success, and Department of Africana Studies, as well as the Chief Diversity Office for providing us with the Diversity, Equity, Innovation Grant that funded this program. We couldn't do it without it. Concluding this series, Examining Our Campus, Part 3, which I previously mentioned is pending, and if all goes according to plan, we will have a program titled Becoming an Anti-Racist Advocate, which is Part 3 of this series. And if confirmed, this will be on April 27th, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. So please be on the lookout. We'll be sure to share that information. And again, check out our events on the USU calendar where Matadors belong. And thank you so much, everyone.